Profits. As always, we thank you guys so much for being here. As you can tell, I'm the only one recording today. Rob is out in New York. He got paid to teach at a conference, so congratulations, Rob. I hope you do a good job and have lots of fun out there. Just filmed yesterday with Ryan. It was just the two of us. Unfortunately, something happened. The file got corrupted and had some issues, and so we're going to have to refilm that tomorrow. But we don't want to make you guys wait another day for some awesome fantasy content, so here I am by myself. Hopefully I'm not too boring just through this together. Of course, before we get started, let's talk about a few things. The first is make sure not just to watch our videos, go check out all of our other places. Check out our website and our Instagram particularly. Those we're posting tons of things on there. You can go to our website and see our rankings with tons of information from every player that has any fantasy relevance this season. Leave a comment about them and their stats, and so lots to check out there. You can also, and definitely should, follow our Instagram. We make 2 posts every day, lots of information about player news from mini camps and OTAs to injury reports and suspensions, and even just stats that we find interesting. So there's a lot to check out other than this. Of course, we ask you guys, leave a comment and like the video. Of course, subscribe if you're not subscribed already. But without any further ado, we'll just get right into it. As you can tell from the title, this is our fantasy dark horse video. So we're just talking about players that are a little bit undervalued. Now, I wanted to make this unique because basically an undervalued player is somewhat just a sleeper. So why is this not just a sleeper video? Why does it have a different name? Well, that's because these are guys who actually have value and people know about them. We'll be talking about Doug Baldwin, Melvin Gordon, Matthew Stafford, and George Kittel. These are names that people know about. They're not sleepers. Everyone's heard of these guys. They're guys who have a chance potentially to be #1 at their position. As I said, we're going to do a quarterback, a running back, wide receiver, and a tight end. Not going to be doing kicker or defense, but if you guys would like, we'll make sure to make more kicker and defense videos. Just let us know down below, but I assume that's not something most people are too interested in. Anyways, now of course these guys aren't ranked as our #1 guys for a reason. There's a reason they're called dark horse. However, these guys definitely have an opportunity, and we found some extremely interesting stats about these guys to be players that we think could really break out or be the #1 guy possibly. But again, we don't think that's going to happen for a reason. So I guess we won't waste any more of your time. We'll just get right into the first player. All right, so Matthew Stafford is our quarterback dark horse player. This is probably the most boring pick. I'll try to get through it somewhat fast. It's not amazingly interesting, but he is a solid choice. If you're looking for a quarterback who's underrated, Matthew Stafford is one of them, and he's a guy who could potentially be a #1 fantasy quarterback this season. One thing to note about fantasy players is fantasy players almost never repeat as the #1 fantasy guy. If you come out and have a fantastic season, it's almost impossible to stay that #1 guy. And I think that's huge news, important news for this list. That means that any one of these guys has an opportunity to move up past other guys because things are constantly changing. So here's Matthew Stafford. Last year he had over 4,400 yards and 29 touchdowns. 29 touchdowns is great. Of course, we like to see him hit 30, but really what's 1 touchdown? He was extremely effective. His stats were not unbelievable, but at 7.87 yards per attempt and a quarterback rating of 99.3, it is undeniable that Matthew Stafford is a great NFL quarterback. He has been less of a fantasy option over the last couple of years because for a while he didn't have the greatest weapons. But I think that he does this year. Excuse me, sorry, I'm sick, so I've got some stuff in my throat and some bad allergies. Anyways, with Marvin Jones, Golden Tate, and Kenny Golladay, I think that he has the weapons. Now, of course, he lost Eric Ebron, but Eric Ebron was extremely ineffective the last few years. There's a reason they didn't want him to come back. There's a reason they let him go. Now, those 3 guys combined last year, 181 receptions on 278 targets, 2,551 yards, and 7 touchdowns. All of that, well, Kenny Golladay was a rookie, were kind of working his way into the NFL and played a lot of games injured. Marvin Jones is a great #1 wide receiver, and Golden Tate is a huge PPR guy. He's got a variety. I really like how they all have different roles and they all play differently. I think that fits very well into Matthew Stafford's play. Another thing is that he spreads the ball around to a lot of players. Last year, he actually finished 6th among fantasy quarterbacks in standard leagues. In fact, the #1 fantasy scoring quarterback last year only scored or only threw 4 more touchdowns than him. So he wouldn't need to have a huge statistical increase to go from number 6 to number 1. And here's why I think that he will. Last year he had the 32nd ranked rushing attempt and the 27th defense. That's brutal. And they made hardly any attempts to upgrade that. Now they went out and got Kerryon Johnson, but they did lose Riley Reiff, who was their best run blocker on the offensive line. And so I think that that's huge. Again, with the 27th defense, Matthew Stafford is forced to throw the ball. I think this is a solid pick, and he could have a great season, especially like that he plays in a dome. He won't have too many weather issues. A lot of the teams that he play in domes like Minnesota. So that's very good news. Worst thing you want to have is your fantasy quarterback, who's been great all season, goes into Buffalo and it rains foot while they're playing, a foot of snow. So I think that bodes very well for him. Again, like I said, this is probably one of the more boring picks, but whatever. We'll get into some of the more interesting guys next, but I think that if you're looking for a guy who could have a great season and is underrated, Matthew Stafford is definitely one of the FFP's dark horses this season. All right, so now we get to talk about one of the more exciting picks of the 4 picks, probably the second option, probably the second most likely as a guy to break out to be number 1 at their position, and that's Melvin Gordon. Now, I think the biggest thing working against Melvin Gordon's ability to be the number 1 at his position is just how insanely competitive it is. I mean, imagine you're competing against David Johnson, Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, Alvin Kamara. It's insane. However, I think that he definitely has the talent. The 6'1", 215-pound, 25-year-old running back for the Chargers has been very effective over his career. We always say here at the FFP that that just having the opportunity to play and getting the carries and the touches is really half the battle. And he has no competition. In fact, the Chargers let Brandon Oliver go. Now his only backup that has any chance of taking any time or receptions or anything away from him is Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler is not a great runner. He's mostly just a guy who can catch out of the backfield. Over the last 2 seasons, Melvin Gordon has averaged 1,051 yards, 12 touchdowns, 50 catches, 447 receiving yards. Those numbers are actually extremely effective and very exciting. 447 yards receiving is fairly good. The 50 catches is a lot higher. One of the big concerns that people have had for Melvin Gordon over the last few years is he doesn't catch out of the backfield. He has low yards per carry. They have some concerns. As far as him not being a good receiving running back, I understand why people might think that. He came out of the draft as extremely ineffective, but has really worked his way into that role. In fact, the last 3 years, he's had an increase in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. So let's look at that. His rookie season in 2015, he had 37 targets with 33 catches, 192 yards, and no touchdowns. In 2016, that goes up to 55 targets, 41 catches, 419 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And last year, I think, was probably his biggest step forward. 75 targets, 58 receptions, 476 yards, and 4 TDs. Excuse me. He's really working his way to be a top NFL receiving running back. In fact, he ranked 6th in receptions and 5th in targets in 2017. In fact, he had 1 more reception than Todd Gurley. So I think that that's huge, huge news. I really like that over the last 2 seasons, he has had 12 touchdowns combined both years. To be a number 1 running back, you have to catch out of the backfield and get in the end zone. And we've seen he catches out of the backfield, and he does get in the end zone. Now, of course, if he's going to be the number 1 fantasy running back, that 12 needs to come up to about 16 or 17. But that very well could happen because Antonio Gates and Hunter Henry both left. That's huge. There are not a lot of weapons on that team, and the ball's got to go somewhere. Another piece of news is that the Chargers head coach announced that they are trying to get Melvin Gordon the ball more, both in the rushing and specifically in the passing game. So he could be even more effective, even more dangerous. Very exciting. I wouldn't be surprised if he had 5 receiving touchdowns, 600 yards, and 65, 70 catches this year, which for me is easily enough to consider him an elite running back right up there with those other guys. I think he's extremely underrated. So let's address the one problem that I think everyone has with him that is somewhat hard to deny, and that's his yards per carry. At 3.9 yards per carry, it's kind of embarrassing. It's very sad, and he makes me very nervous. In fact, last year I had a chance to draft him in a league, and I didn't because that made me nervous, and I thought he was going to have a bad year last year. Well, I was wrong. He didn't have a bad year last year, and I think that I misinterpreted his numbers. And here's what I mean by that. Their offensive line, the Chargers' offensive line, ranked 31st in run blocking. I think that his yards per carry is not a product of an ineffective Melvin Gordon, but an ineffective Chargers offensive line. Finally, this last offseason, they went out and signed and started working on their offensive line. It's been an issue and a problem for years, and the Chargers finally devoted some energy to it. I know they spent many years finally attempting to improve their defense and keep their offense going, and they finally got the defense that they're looking for, which I think is huge news. With such a good defense like that, they'll be able to rely upon Melvin Gordon quite a bit and just keep giving him the ball to move the chain, so to speak. So why do I think their offense is going to be better? Well, they went out and signed elite center Mike Pouncey. Mike Pouncey is arguably the best center in the league. He is so dominant and so good. What I like about Mike Pouncey is that he is specifically a run-blocking center. That's what he does well. He's very smart and very intelligent. They bragged about how good he is at leading his team and leading his offensive linemen. They always say that the center is the quarterback of the offensive line, making adjustments and calling out reads. And so I think that's going to bode really well. I think they're going to have a much improved run blocking game and pass blocking. And so I think that Melvin Gordon could have a great season. All right, now I get to talk about Doug Baldwin. Doug Baldwin I'm very excited about him. In fact, he was the reason that I decided to make this video. The 5'10", 192-pound wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks, I think could actually be an elite wide receiver this season. I think a lot of people are underestimating him. Let's just get into why. Now, of course, as I said before, it's extremely difficult to be the #1 guy. There's so much competition, just like at the running back position. Imagine competing with Julio Jones, A.J. Green, DeAndre Hopkins, Antonio Brown. But I think that of all the guys on this list, Doug Baldwin has the best chance of actually doing it. Again, we don't have him ranked as the #1 guy for a reason, but man, look at some information about this guy. Over the last 3 seasons, he has finished in the top 13 every year. The last 3 years, he's averaged 82 catches on 115 targets, 1,062 yards, and 9.7 TDs. So we know that he's been extremely effective and he's a good wideout. Of course, I love the fact that he's the #1 receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. That's great news. Even better news is that Paul Richardson and Jimmy Graham left this offseason. Together last year, they had 178 targets, 1,223 yards, and 16 touchdowns. That's a lot of stats to just walk out. Russell Wilson has to throw the ball somewhere, and he's going to throw it to his main man, Doug Baldwin. The Seattle Seahawks did not bring anyone to replace those guys. And of course, I don't mean that Doug Baldwin is going to get an extra 16 touchdowns, but the ball is going to go his way more. I think that he could easily be a huge end zone guy this year. Even more importantly, Doug Baldwin in the fourth quarter is extremely effective. Look at this. In the fourth quarter and overtime, when throwing the ball to, Doug Baldwin generates a passer rating of 144.5. That's hands down best in the NFL. He's so effective in the late game. And that's extremely important for a lot of wide receivers. I don't personally care. Are you effective in the first quarter or the fourth quarter or the third or the second? Like, does it really matter? In Doug Baldwin's case, yes, it does. It definitely does. And here's why. When trailing, he has 38 receptions, 504 yards, and 7 touchdowns. In the third and the fourth quarter, he has 38 receptions, 580 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So again, we see another reason why he's so effective late in the game. Now that's extremely important because the Seattle Seahawks this season will be trailing a lot. I think that they're going to have some serious struggles. In fact, last year they did. Their defense extremely struggled. Now, they spent a lot of games where they expected Russell Wilson to be kind of Superman. They have an ineffective running game and a defense that this year could be quite embarrassing. In fact, last year it extremely struggled, and this year in the offseason they lost Richard Sherman, Michael Bennett, Sheldon Richardson, and Deshaun Sheed. So I think that there's a lot of concerns there. That could be even worse by those losses. The defense could extremely struggle, and that's why a lot of fantasy stats could go to Doug Baldwin late in the game, and of course to Russell Wilson. I think that could definitely happen. I think that it will happen. In fact,
A lot of statistics like that. DeAndre Hopkins, the #1 fantasy receiver last year, was exactly how he did that. A terrible defense, a good wide receiver who gets most of the targets, and a good quarterback who gets him the ball. I mean, that's really the formula for a great fantasy wide receiver, and Doug Baldwin checks off every box. Man, I'm so excited to see who he can do this year.
All right, so let's talk about our last fantasy dark horse player, and that's George Kittle. Now, it's extremely important to be able to find a sleeper or a guy who is undervalued or a dark horse or whatever label it is you want to put on it. Anyways, it's important to find that sort of guy at the tight end position. Of course, if you're watching us and you've watched us for a while, you know there's just not a lot of talent at the tight end position, and especially if you don't get one of the early guys, you're kind of screwed. So here's a guy that we think you can get a little bit later that definitely has some value. His rookie season, George Kittle had a very good year. 43 catches, 515 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's really, really impressive for a rookie season. If you watch a lot of our other videos, one of them you may have watched where we mentioned that rookie tight ends extremely have serious struggles. In fact, only 26 rookies in the history of the NFL have ever had 500 receiving yards at the tight end position their rookie season. So that's fairly impressive. Would be even more impressive, I think he would have had far better stats, except for he didn't really have a great quarterback situation for the first little while. And he was competing with Vance McDonald. The 49ers eventually traded Vance McDonald after being so impressed with George Kittle. That's great news. Like I said a minute ago, he had a very slow start. His quarterback situation wasn't great. I mean, how would you play if C.J. Beathard was throwing you the ball? Well, you probably wouldn't play well. But anyways, he took off the last 3 games, had an increase in targets, yards, and touchdowns, and receptions the last 3 games, and finished the last game with his first 100-yard game of his NFL career. So that's awesome. Good for him. It's especially difficult to do at the tight end position. One of the things that I really like is got Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy Garoppolo is a good quarterback, and Garoppolo doesn't really have anyone to throw to. His receivers are Pierre Garçon, Marquise Goodwin, and Trent Taylor. Neither of those guys step out to me. Now, Trent Taylor is a guy we did a deep sleeper video on, but again, he's just a deep sleeper like I just mentioned, and so I don't think he's going to be phenomenal. Pierre Garçon is getting old and his production is lowering. Marquise Goodwin is really nothing but a speedster and a deep ball threat. I think that George Kittle will actually possibly be his main target all season. Here's some things that they noted at the NFL Combine, his review, and things that they said about him going into the draft. He has the ability to catch the ball on all 3 levels. Let's stop at that first one. We'll talk about some other things they said about him, but that's absolutely huge. Very few tight ends are able to do that. What they mean by catch the ball on all 3 levels is basically just short, medium, and long range. Short range, can he play against linebackers? Can he make red zone catches? Can he catch in traffic? Yes, he can do that. Is he fast? Just straight up 40-yard dash speed? Yes, he can catch deep balls. And how's his route running? Is he quick? Not just dead sprinting, but how can he run those medium routes? Apparently he runs all 3 very well, and they're extremely impressed. Again, I think it's huge news that they traded Vance McDonald when they got George Kittle, so I think that's great. Other things they said that he is extremely physical, especially after the catch. He is explosive, has reliable hands, only dropped 1 ball his senior year in college, and can catch in traffic. So he's a guy I think could come out and have a great season. Now, he's competing with Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, Evan Ingram. There's a lot of very talented tight ends out there. I don't actually think that he'll be #1, but if a guy was going to come outside of those top 4 and surprise us to be #1, I know it's a stretch, but I'm going to go with George Kittle. So that's our fantasy dark horse players for this season. Again, it's important to remember we don't think these guys are going to be the #1 players at their position, but if you're going to take a stretch for a guy, maybe you're not sure who you want to pick, maybe it's a certain round, you got all these different options, maybe you're in the 2nd round or late 1st round and you're like, I don't know what running back to take, and Melvin Gordon's out there, maybe you take a shot on him. Maybe some of the few elite tight ends are gone, take a shot on George Kittle. I think these guys could have explosive seasons. As always, we thank you so much for watching. You have a great day and God bless.